Thank you to Dr. Raffner and to the audience for coming to this session. I'm Frederick Meyer. I'm the Associate Director of the Artificial Intelligence Institute at the University of Georgia. And our speaker today is Dr. Janet Raffner, who will talk on AI and digital games for fostering and assessing creativity. Dr. Raffner is the Junior Center Director at the Center for Hybrid Intelligence, which is in the Department of Management at Aarhus University. She's also an affiliated researcher at the Interacting Mind Center. She holds a PhD in Information and Communication Technology at Aarhus, or from Aarhus. She has a prior master's degree in physics from the Niels Bohr Institute in Copenhagen, or at the Copenhagen University, and before that, a bachelor's in physics from the University of Virginia. Her current research focus is on citizen science, psychometric creativity assessment, computational co-creativity, human AI interaction, and participatory futures. She's been the recipient of a Fulbright Fellowship, a Salzburg Global Fellowship, and a research award from the Sonophilia Foundation in Germany. At this point, she's authored dozens of peer-reviewed publications. She's given dozens of keynotes and talks, served on the advisory boards of multiple nonprofits and companies. And she's also been the PI or co-investigator on multiple grants at this point. I also should mention that she has a background in art, which plays a big role in her research. So thank you very much, Dr. Raffner, for coming, and we're looking forward to having you talk. Just as a note, I don't know if Amy has put it into the chat, but questions will come at the end. If you have questions, please put them in the chat. Okay, so thank you, Dr. Raffner.
Wonderful. Thank you for the kind introduction and invitation to speak. I'm really looking forward to talking to you all about games and AI for fostering and assessing creativity. It's a topic I'm very passionate about and I engage with on a daily basis, both in my personal and professional life. So I hope that you enjoy the talk. I'll try to keep it light and relatively broad. So if you have very specific questions about certain types of algorithms or certain types of psychometric assessment, please just put it in the chat and I'm happy to go into more details later. So I just want to start off on a nice note today. I thought considering the talk is about AI and creativity, I'd begin with a haiku and an image that I generated with both ChatGPT and DALL-E 2. And the haiku for today's talk is: code, colors tangle, AI fosters artful thoughts, creativity beams. So that's it. That sums it up. You all can go now. No, I'm just kidding. I do have more to say. You have already gone over my background, so I can skip over all of this and get straight to where I am today. I'm the Junior Center Director and a researcher at the Center for Hybrid Intelligence at Aarhus University, and I work in a big team. So the projects that I talk about that are based on my own research are done in collaboration with lots of really cool people, ranging from those who work in game development to machine learning, cognitive science, business administration, even quantum physics. So we take a wide range of perspectives on these very important and timely topics. So today I will give a crash course in creativity, Creativity 101, just to set the stage. And then I will have a hybrid intelligence and human AI co-creativity 101, and then talk about two aspects. One, games and AI for creativity assessment, and games and AI for fostering creativity. I'm assuming everyone has a pretty good idea what digital games are, so I don't need to go into that in the overview. So creativity is undeniably one of the most important skills, or attributes, everyone has different names for it, that's needed to thrive now in the fourth industrial revolution. It is a science, although some people still have a vision that it is mysterious, maybe even working of the gods. It is actually a science, and there are ways of measuring it, fostering it, and teaching about it. Modern science considers creativity to be a result of measurable psychometric processes. So we actually can understand a little bit more deeply as to what creativity is. Before I get into definitions, I just want to make sure everyone has an understanding that creativity can be viewed from a variety of different perspectives. On one hand, you have this framework called the 2 C's, where you have a big C, which deals with eminence, world-class accomplishments, high impact, culturally significant work. So those are people who, as it says, have really made a mark on society through their creative work. Then you have little c creativity, which is everyday creativity, hobbies, ideas, jokes, quips, things that are new for you, not new for the world at large. Both of these are equally important, and algorithms today are making a big impact on both aspects, the big C creativity and little c creativity. Then on the other hand, you have the 4P framework. So that talks about other different actors in creativity. So you have products, so that's an idea or a performance, song, something that's made, an end result, an artifact. Then you have the person, so that's qualities and attributes. You could say, oh, I'm not a very creative person, but that's something creative that I made. And then you have a process. So that deals with mental functions, strategies, brainstorming, so how you got from point A to point B. A lot of people now bring up the process with respect to AI and creativity. So maybe the outcome could be viewed as creative from an external perspective, but the process itself is more, there's more debate as to whether that could be creative. And then last you have the press, and press is just the fun way of them getting an extra P in there. And it really has to do with the pressures or the environment around it. So one could ask, if you work in a creative environment, is this a creative place to think? And then we can define creativity here as a standard definition is sort of novel and useful. So it has these 2 components, something that is novel or appropriate given the context. So novel or original, and then useful or appropriate. So for example, if you have a piece of artwork, some might say it's not so useful, but it is appropriate to express something. And then when it comes to creative processes, today I'll be talking about 2 major processes. One is divergent thinking, and the second is convergent thinking. And so divergent thinking is exploring lots of possibilities, and convergent thinking is deciding what to do. And if you come from a computer science background or a natural sciences, or maybe even social sciences, you might know this also as exploration and exploitation. So you go through a period of exploring, and then you're exploiting or refining solutions. Okay, so that was the brief background on creativity. Now here's the brief background on hybrid intelligence. So I'm pretty sure most people have heard of artificial intelligence. Well, recently there has been a push for bringing humans more into the loop or more into the process. And so hybrid intelligence is really an interdisciplinary field that combines researchers from human-computer interaction and social sciences and computer science to have optimal synergies between humans and algorithms, bringing that human closer into the loop of various algorithmic processes. And so this here just shows the trend. So back in 2013, there was big reports about how AI was replacing all these different jobs, and people were becoming very concerned about it. And then as we move towards, okay, even this is outdated now with 2022, it's becoming more and more apparent that humans are not going to be replaced. There are still many, many things that are that must be done by humans and should be done by humans. And so there's a push for research that really brings these areas together, and that's hybrid intelligence. And so here, this is just a visual diagram, so you can think about how we have AI today. And in one hand, you could be moving the human further out of the loop to what you would have autonomous operation. And then you could also be moving the human further into the loop. From the human-computer interaction perspective, you have what's called human-centered AI. And in that area, human-centered AI really focuses on the algorithm, whichever model is being used, as a tool for the person. So it should be considered much a tool like you would have a hammer or something else, where the human is really in control. Where hybrid intelligence, it tries to take a little bit of the best of both worlds, where you have, if you move towards autonomous AI, it has a potential for a lot of disruption. So disruption can be good in some cases, but it also can be very problematic. So you can get flash crashes, and you get de-skilling, where people are using a technology and then they forget how to do something they used to be able to do. However, the disruptive potential can also have some good. It can move different disciplines and different economic factors also in positive directions. So in the field of hybrid intelligence, it focuses on human AI synergies, and also a focus on this concept of mutual learning. So mutual learning is where the human and the algorithm are both continuously learning over time. Okay, so when and why is it needed? It certainly is not needed for everything. In particular, I am interested in finding these synergies for learning what's called soft skills. I don't love that name, but it refers to artistic, creativity, flexibility, imaginative, intuition, sensibility. So I'm really interested in hybrid intelligence or human AI interaction in this particular area. Okay, now moving forward towards digital creative interaction. I'm briefly going over 3 different areas. The first is creative support tools. So that's where you have human-computer interaction researchers building tools that support users. Then you have this computational creativity. And that's what I mentioned before, how sometimes you have algorithms that can produce things that could be considered creative, like music or artwork. But in these cases, it's an AI or a computer science researcher that is developing an algorithm that generates an artifact. Then you have this field of computational co-creativity, and that's where I'm most interested in. So this is where you have the human-computer interaction researchers and the AI researchers building tools that support co-creation. So that's tools that support a human and an algorithm co-creating together. And some examples of these, I'm sure all of you are now seeing AI-generated images everywhere, but such processes can be seen in images. It can be also seen in design, engineering, architecture, writing, and I'll get to just a few examples today. Yes, so all of you have probably heard of these AI image generation tools. First of all, the way that human AI co-creative image generation, such as Stable Diffusion or DALL-E 2, as you probably know, work. They use these large language models, which have been trained on corpuses of language, of text. And then you can add an input like this, an astronaut riding a horse by text. So you write it in, and then you get a variety of different images. This is just an example. I'll get into some more details about it a little bit later, but I want you to have a sense of what human AI co-creation can look like. And if you are interested, I have, let's see if I have my QR code here. Yes. So if anyone can scan the QR code there, here is a list of lots of resources if you want to investigate how you can use some of these either image generation, text generation, audio generation, research tools. It goes on. I recommend you check out this list. Okay, so now that was the background information. The key concepts, you should now have a general idea of what I mean by creativity when I talk about it, and also a general idea of what I mean when I talk about human AI co-creativity. So with regards to creativity assessment, researchers for a long time have been trying to understand human creativity. So what are the processes, those convergent and divergent thinking tasks? Well, there have not really been a lot of advances in this in the past 50 years. And a big issue is that we have psychologists and those who do psychometric research in education in one camp. And then you have these human-computer interaction researchers in another camp. And so you have one group of people who are building all of these cool technologies and another group of people who are trying to understand, for example, individual differences and how people are creative. And what I'm interested in my work, and particularly this first project I'll talk about, is how can we get these two groups of people to talk together? And how can we use, as it shows here, gamified, what's called stealth assessment methods, utilization of internet technology and machine learning and artificial intelligence in a variety of different ways for creativity assessment. Okay, so how are people usually assessed for creativity? As I mentioned before, this concept of divergent thinking. Divergent thinking is coming up with many different possible answers to a prompt. And often a test for this is called the alternative uses test. And in this case, you're given a prompt, for example, a brick, and asked to come up with as many different creative alternative uses for the brick. And so I would ask you what some thoughts are on these, but I'm not monitoring the chat. So I will just show you a couple examples here. So it could be used to build a house. It could be used as a doorstop. It could be used as an exfoliator. And so people then are measured on how original their response is, how many responses they provide, and the different categories of their responses. So essentially, do they have lots of responses that refer to the brick as a building material? That would all be in one category. Then the brick as a weapon, the brick as a beauty product, all of these different things, those would be 3 different categories. So we also have a visual test for this. This test, participants are provided with this blank sheet here in the middle with these circles, and they're asked to fill them in. And the evaluation criteria is the same. So participants are asked to come up with lots of different creative images for each of these circles, and they're evaluated on these concepts I mentioned: fluency, so the number of responses, flexibility, different categories. In this case, it could be 5 different versions of a smiley face, and then they switch to different types of planets, and those would be considered 2 categories. And then also elaboration, which is the level of detail. So are they drawing something very simple, just a mouth and eyes, or are they doing something very detailed? So those are the basic methods for how people are assessing creativity. For divergent thinking. For convergent thinking, we have, unfortunately, only one test, which is not so great, and that is called the remote associates test. And in this case, participants are given 3 different words. Here you can see cottage, Swiss, and cake, and they're asked to find a word that brings them together. So in this case, cheese. And as you can see, especially from the test with the brick and this particular test, it's very language-based. So a lot has to do with your level of vocabulary. And the level of vocabulary doesn't necessarily match with your creativity. And then the one in the middle, the drawing task, doesn't necessarily, your skills, your ability to draw, doesn't necessarily match with your creativity. So think about this and think about a few ways that AI could possibly come in. Okay, so this is the one dense slide here, but for those who have more of a background in psychology or in psychometrics, I'll just briefly comment on this. So problems with these tests, they have weak correlations. And so that essentially means that one test for divergent thinking doesn't correlate well with another test for divergent thinking. There are problems disentangling that convergent and divergent phases. So for example, if you are looking at the task where you're asked to come up with uses for a brick, at some point in your mind, maybe you think, oh, a flower. And then you say, oh, no, that won't work. And so you have already gone through an idea and a refinement phase in your head, but the test doesn't capture that. Then you have absence of consensus among researchers about construct definition. That basically means that people are still arguing about what creativity actually is. Then we have lack of real-world predictive power. So that means that there's a big question. Okay, how much does writing one of those tests mean that I'm creative in my job or in my life? And then the last one is a reliance on time-consuming and subjective scoring. So I've gone over these tests, but then it's a question of, okay, who rates them? Who evaluates that? How do you do that? It's typically done by people, and it takes a lot of time, and you have rater fatigue and lots of problems, subjectivity when you have different levels of expertise scoring these. And then lastly, a lack of battery-based approaches. So there is a consensus in the creativity field that one test cannot stand alone. So it's not one test of all creativity, but incorporating multiple tests into an experiment means that it's going to take longer for scoring. And so often people do rely only on one test. Okay, so how do digital games and AI help solve this problem? So from the game side, games are more visual than language-based, so that helps in that component. They're more casual, natural, and you have immersed behavior, so that can combat some things like testing anxiety and this researcher effect. And then lastly, and what I find is very interesting, is the possibility for fine-grained metrics for assessing creative products and processes. So think back to those 4 Ps when I talked about all of the different aspects. Here, I'm interested in both the products and the processes. With these typical tests, participants are just scored on their end result. So that means that it's whatever drawing that they have there that they're scored on. We don't know with those hand-drawn tests how they got there, and we don't have metrics of understanding, did they draw 2 little lines very slowly and then think about it for a while and then draw the rest. And so these game environments, they allow for fine grain. It's essentially lots of data on how people get from point A to point B. On the AI side, we can use algorithms for clustering data. So essentially sifting through lots of data and putting it into different categories so we can help to, for example, understand player types. So types of participant behavior, maybe lots of people go through short iterations between exploring and exploiting, whereas another type of participants, they only exploit for a little bit at the end and the rest of the time is explorative. Then we can also use algorithms for scoring. So there's some really cool work coming out now for scoring of these creativity assessments using algorithms, which can help alleviate the time it needs to evaluate, as well as some of the subjectivity. And these advancements in large language models, as I mentioned before, are really incredible. So we have been moving from just being able to evaluate a few words or a short sentence to even creative stories using algorithms. And lastly, and also most interestingly for me, is AI can be used to help many people create more complex outputs. So in this case, I'm very interested in how AI can help lots of people create something much more complex than that little drawing. And that comes back to all of these images and AI generated images and drawing. Okay, so if there are lots of benefits for games and AI to assess creativity, why are we not using it? This was a question I had, a research question I had during my PhD, and I did a review of this. And so what we found in this review is that there are a handful of games out there. We found 11 that were used to really assess creativity. But unfortunately, these games are not really publicly available. They haven't been designed to scale. And often they have not been brought beyond a pilot phase. And so this gets back to that first comment I made about this divide between researchers in psychology and psychometrics, education, and those in human-computer interaction. Most of these games were published in that field of human-computer interaction. And so that shows that there are some really cool ideas coming out of researchers who work with technology, but there's a divide between those researchers and the researchers who are interested in improving creativity assessment. Okay, so the conclusions from the review found that it's important to develop a robust nonverbal assessment for convergent thinking, something better than that remote associates task, where you have to find the common word between cottage and Swiss, and one other one. Also, that these games should explore a span from simple and stylized to complex and real-life events, because we want to try to understand how much of creativity we can what type and how much of creative interactions we can learn from simple interactions, but also scale towards more real life events, so we can then see that overlap. And then to have separate efforts combined into a suite of games so that we can look at player behavior across several different interactions. And so as another part of my research, I have led the development of a creativity assessment game-based creativity assessment suite. We call it CREA, and has 4 different games. And you can see briefly what they look like here. We have CREA tiles on the left, and there are 10 blocks that participants move around to create different images. We have a mode that facilitates convergent thinking. So that's the diving in phase, and refining, that's here in the bottom, where participants have to select one of these images and move it towards a target. So they have to move the blocks around to get to a target. And then we have a divergent phase, which I'll also get to in a moment, where we ask participants to create as many dog-like figures as they could out of these blocks. And then we have CREA Blender, and this is the human AI co-creative aspect of the game. So this uses a type of human AI image generation. So humans and algorithms working with a model to create images. And in this case, it uses what's called a GAN, a generative adversarial network. That was the precursor to Stable Diffusion. And participants are given the same types of tasks. So create as many different animal-like figures as you can, as well as you have a convergent thinking task 2, where they have to select images and then move towards a target image. But I'll show you some pictures of that too. Then we have 2 standard tasks, because as any psychometric assessment needs to do, is to evaluate a new tool against old tools. And that's what's called a convergent validity. So we have, whenever we try to develop a new measure, we have to look at it in comparison to commonly used and accepted measures, previously validated measures, if we're trying to look at the same concept. And so here we looked at matrix abstract reasoning. In this case, we use this instead of the remote associates task because the abstract reasoning task here with the blocks is a lot closer to over here, moving these tiles around. And research supports that abstract reasoning is a strong component in convergent thinking. And then for divergent thinking, we used the standard alternative uses task. In this case, we asked them about a tire. So what are the alternative uses for a tire? Just as a quick overview here again on CREA tiles, they have all these blocks and move them around. So, and then on CREA Blender here, you can see a video. Briefly, this is the convergent thinking mode. So that's the converging on a solution mode. And here participants are selecting one of from the set of images. And then they had to, after they selected the right set, they're moving this slider to evaluate the weight of the image. and then generate it. Oops. Okay, here, yes. And then this is the divergent mode on the right. Again, participants are given a prompt to create animal-like figures or animal-like images, and then they move the sliders around to explore what's called the latent space, but that's essentially the space that the algorithm can create images in. So they're exploring and looking for creative images in that space. Okay, and then here's something a bit fun. We did a large study, large-ish, about 400 participants, used Crea, and we have just published on it now. And one of the tasks we asked them was to create as many different dog-like figures as possible. And here are some of the shapes that participants came up with. So I'll let you just take a moment here and think about how many different dogs do you see. So this shows that it's actually one of the cool things about having these different types of tasks is that even though it's just 10 bricks, you can get a lot of really interesting figures made. So here's some of the classifications of it. My favorite are, oh, here it is. Perhaps a poodle and a Doberman with the big ears. Okay, so as I mentioned before, the ways that AI can come and assist in creative assessment, it can also be used to help cluster players. So here we're looking at different clusters of players and how they behave. Are they making lots of similar shapes or are they moving in different categories of shapes? If you want to visualize it too, you can actually go here. I can share that link later and you can see all of the different shapes that people have made. Okay, yes, that was Create Blender. And I'm going to emphasize this because it comes into the discussion on AI fostering creativity as well. In this tool that we developed, this game that we developed, participants move different weights of the images to create a final image. And so that means that if you have a starting image and you move the slider really high on it, then you're going to have a lot of that image contributing to a final image. If you move it very low, you're going to have less of that image contributing to the final image. And this tool uses, as I said, GANs, these generative adversarial networks. That was the grandfather to what we're now using now with these text-to-image models and Stable Diffusion. Okay, so I think maybe this is my only graph or one of my few graphs here, but I think it's kind of cool. When I talk about how can we actually assess people using these types of games, I want to show you a participant convergence. So here you can, each of these dots, little dots here, are images that people made. And so we look at their pattern. Okay, are they actually in control of the system? That's a big question with all of these AI technologies is, are people just randomly moving it around? Is the experience controlled? What is, in this case, the creative process? And so we were very excited to see that, yes, people were in control. They were able to move towards a target with only making at most 2 wrong moves in the direction away from the target. Okay. So now for the last 10 minutes, I will get to the discussion on AI and games for fostering creativity. So in this area, I'm working less in psychometric assessment and more focusing on elements of the creative process, also working in creative problem solving. And I am combining my background with citizen science, so engaging the general public in work, along with social science and these digital games and HCI. And I call this type of work, this project called CreaVisions, a casual creator with a purpose, because I like to see how we can use these co-creative technologies for good. And in this project, it's called CreaVisions. It is an AI-assisted participatory futures. So essentially, we have developed a system. First, it was GAN-based, and now we're moving over to Stable Diffusion. So think DALL-E 2, think Midjourney, where participants are asked to imagine what the future of, in this case, their city looks like, and to use these co-creative technologies to generate images of problems that they find in their day-to-day life, and to use it in an ideation phase for creative solutions. And so we have done 5 versions of this now in lots of cities. So in Denmark, in Venice, in Paris. Now we have a series of events coming up in Aarhus and then in Belgrade. And so we have been partnering with municipalities and various stakeholders to harness this co-creative technology to facilitate the general public in actively engaging in a dialogue on complex issues. So first, it started back in 2020 with AI for Good. That was our beta version, and then we moved towards a new version of the game. You see it here on the right. You may recognize those sliders. That's why I said remember it. So participants are moving the sliders to interact with different weights of each image. And then here we included other gamification elements like progression bars and star systems and all of these different things to try to engage participants and get them more in a flow. We also incorporated text. So here we had a competition, and it was a student in the 7th grade that won this one. And this is the image that he created, and it was called What We Have Left. And he wrote a very lovely poem with it. So I think it's really inspiring how these types of technologies can be used to foster creative expression. That's the one I showed you. Then we had a series of events in Venice as well, some pop-up workshops. We were alongside the Biennale, as well as going into, in Venice, they have these rowing clubs, which are often retired Venetians. So I was a bit worried when I was going into the workshop, and I was told the day before, okay, everyone is 65 plus. There are several participants who don't have cell phones or internet connection. I'm thinking, oh my gosh. How am I going to be doing an AI co-creative event here with them? But they loved it. The participants were really excited to be able to express their ideas and their hopes and concerns about the city. We did an exhibition based on this as well, and we had postcards that everyone could take home with them. And we also had a poet who came by and wrote this really lovely poem after he used the technology. And I like this. A small translation from Venetian is watering our curiosity just as we water plants. And I like to think about how we can use these new powerful technologies to water our curiosity. So I'll try to move quickly here to get to some question and answer section. Here is an example specifically from the project in Paris, where we had participants identify problems that they face every day. For example, in this case, a participant was wanted to shed light on health services in Paris, so problems with health services. And then they went through an ideation phase where they looked at the problem from multiple directions. So this is something quite interesting in creative problem solving. There are many aspects to the process, but the first phase, you can call it problem construction and problem identification. And it's actually really important, although most research focuses on the second part, the solutions, how do you solve the problem? But the way you frame a problem really influences how you come up with solutions. And there's cool research showing that both in the public sector and in the private sector, entrepreneurs and researchers who are at the top of their field spend a lot more time on the problem construction phase, just thinking about, okay, what is the problem we're dealing with? And there's research as well on how visualizations like diagrams and sketches can help in that problem construction phase. But really, it's only been studied with designers and architects and engineers because the research shows that you need to have some base level of artistic skill for your diagram or your visualization to be beneficial in that problem identification and construction phase. But here we have a really interesting opportunity to see how these co-creative technologies can help anyone, regardless of their background in design or drawing, to be able to use imagery visualizations as a resource in that problem construction phase. And that's exactly what we did here. And we just submitted our paper on Monday on this aspect. And it was really cool to see how participants, when they had to, in the case of these text-to-image tools, remember the astronaut on a horse where you have to write in the text and then they generate the image. It's really interesting how for participants, just the act of having to write down what the problem was and then write it down in different ways so that they could make their picture better, helped them reformulate which problem it was that they wanted to address. We're also expanding this application to include geotagging and different types of collaboration. So we're interested in exploring collaboration between participants here as well. And this is just a snippet you can see of the process. So what's also really nice about these co-creative tools is that you can track the progress. So I mentioned that at the beginning, these fine-grained metrics. Instead of just getting a final image that someone drew, you get every step along the way. You get every step along the way if you're using a slider-based system by whenever they move and generate. And if you're using a text-to-image system, you get every text prompt. So you can see how people either just refined a little bit on their prompt, or did they jump around and were they using lots of different language to generate the final product. So now we are partnering with the municipality in Aarhus, which is really exciting that the local government wants to use this tool. And so we're working with them with their 7 wild problems. So one of them in particular here is youth mental health. And so we will be running a series of workshops well, one is tonight. I'm giving this talk, so I'm not there. And another one is on Sunday, and then a couple more in May, where we're using our latest version of Crea Visions to help young people to visualize what problems they are, what problems they're facing, and what potential solutions could help address that problem. In this case, you really have to get to know the co-creative process when you're working with these text-to-image models. So you really have to engage in what's called prompt engineering. Believe it or not, it's a lot like grammar, trying to figure out what are the best words to use, and do you want to use more adjectives or nouns? Which word comes first? Do you use a comma? Do you use a colon? Does it make a difference? It's really quite fascinating how much one needs to know about how to talk to the system that you're working with. So it will be exciting to see what the students make. And here is just a small example of this is the town hall in Aarhus. So it was fun to give a presentation at the Aarhus Kommune and start with images of the town hall on fire or on floods. And this was fun to make. It's inevitable climate change in Aarhus, where we have water levels rising, but embracing it, and we're going to have Aarhus be like Venice. So we have gondolas going down the streets. Yes, okay. So that's a tool that I'm using. I just want to mention that these co-creative tools, they're not limited to image generation. There's also a really cool project. It's called Drawing Apprentice. It's not one that I have developed, but I'm familiar with the co-authors for it or the developers of it. They're in Georgia. And so there are lots of applications that, in this case, you're drawing, you draw some lines, and then the algorithm draws some lines back at you. So you go in a cyclical process, ideating with a co-creative tool. And then it can be used for creative writing too. Believe it or not, it's not just used to write exams for students, as most people are afraid of, but it can be used in creative writing. And I have a couple of studies now investigating creative writing. And this is a figure that my master's student created, Ida Hansen. And here it's just you have outlining the creative process here. So you have idea generation, outlining, then you write your first draft, and then you evaluate it, and then you have a final version. And we are investigating the role of AI in this process. So all of these collaborative writing tools, how do they affect people in different parts of the process? And for this study, we're using a freely available tool called Sudowrite. You can see just the interface here. In this case, you write some text, and then you can have the algorithm. It's a generative algorithm. So again, it's based on these large language models that have been trained on lots and lots of text. And when you hit generate, you get these cards on the right-hand side. And in this case, they're suggestions for what to do. So suggestions of directions that you could go in, and you can choose to incorporate them or not. You can choose how many you want to be generated. And in this case, we just finished running a study with creative writers, and we had a few different components. One was interviewing students interviewing participants from Slack. So there's a big Slack channel on how to use these technologies, in this case, Sudowrite. And my master's student, she interviewed several people there. And what I found was really fascinating is that many creative writers were using these tools for character development. So they weren't using it to actually write their story, but they were using it as a dialogue tool to help consider the backstories of their characters. And I think that is it. Just a couple minutes delayed. But the end of it here is really that human AI co-creativity is such a rich field, and I hope that people embrace it to, as I said, water their curiosity rather than to either be afraid of it or feel that that nothing is creative anymore when you have algorithms that can make these things. I hope that I have showed with some of these examples how much power there is in these in hybrid intelligence, human AI co-creativity. And how it can be used to lift up people, whether it's in the general public or whether it is specialists. There's so much room for interesting research and practice in this area. So thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Raffner. If folks want to applaud, they can by clapping in Zoom, but we do have a few minutes for questions. If you do have a question, it probably would be best to put them in chat. I've got some questions. Anna, I assume you have some questions, but already there's one in there, and it seems like it's a general question from Randy Nobleza, just about the limitations of AI. What do you think about AI plus and its ethical dimensions of AI?
Yeah, so I can easily spend the next 10 minutes talking
Sure.
about those, but I'll try to keep it short. So one aspect that with respect to creative AI or these technologies that can make creative outputs, I want to be clear here. These are statistical probabilities. This is mathematics and computer science that's generating this. There is a huge body of research and creativity that focuses on context and experience and inspiration. These systems, they're not inspired like a human is inspired. And that's something that I don't believe that they will be. They won't have that same emotion which drives the production of a creative work. And so I think really you have that divide there. Also something to note, in the beginning when I was talking about hybrid intelligence, one of the key components in hybrid intelligence is mutual learning. So the human and the algorithm learning over time. I want to be very clear also that currently these generative AI models that everyone is using don't learn. They may appear to learn, so you might have this emulated learning, but it really doesn't learn over time. It's because you have a pre-trained model. It's this I don't have a better word for it than a model, but you have this system that has been trained by lots of text. So it could have read Shakespeare, it could have read, I don't know, Cummings, all these different people, and has been trained maybe even on lots of research papers. But when you are interacting with it, you can't train it with more information that's specialized on yourself. And so that's a big limitation of it right now. There are smaller models. One that I also have a project I didn't talk about here with a company called Autodesk. They make architectural design software, so CAD software. And in that program, we created our own model that designs layouts for architects. And in that system, we looked at how willing participants are to train the model. So in the system, to train it for their own personalized use. But right now, none of these publicly available, either text to image or text to text models are actually learning about you. With respect to ethics, I am part of, at Aarhus University, we have a Center for Aesthetics of AI Images. And we talk a lot about ethics in images, image production. There are so many issues that one can consider, for example, in deep fakes. And really, it's coming down to a question of legality with regards to ownership in these images as well. I don't know if many of you know, but there are several large lawsuits out there right now towards Stability AI primarily, which has created some of these text-to-image systems because they have been trained on images that were copyrighted. So in response to this, also, Adobe has come out with a new text-to-image software that has been trained only on images that they had the rights to. So there's big discussions there. And actually, I was just speaking about a month ago at a conference for AI and for generative models and music. And one of the biggest reasons why generative music is not as popular now as text and image is because there's much stricter copyright or enforcement of copyright on songs. And so people who are using or trying to develop models for music or audio in general have a much more limited data set, not because there's legally it's not any different, it's just much more enforced. One more aspect I want to talk about on the ethical or societal implications. I mentioned this concept very briefly, de-skilling. And I have written about that, actually, de-skilling in the age of AI. So it's essentially, this concept of de-skilling is not new. It's been around for, I think, maybe even almost a century. When we have a new technology, it takes over a certain part of a task, like assembly line, meat processing, looms, all of these different things. It takes over a handicraft. It takes over something that people have been doing. And then less people do it, people forget about it. There are a lot of issues now because AI technologies are not just taking over what you could think of as blue collar work, but it's moving into white collar work, skilled trades, knowledge workers. And there's a big discussion about more or less what is safe to use in society if we're going to be afraid that people will lose their skill set. And that's also why I highlight the concept of mutual learning, because I think it's very important to have this pact for the researchers that are creating these technologies, that the human is learning over time. You're not just giving your data to an algorithm, so it will be further trained on. Sorry, that was a long answer, but to different aspects.
So just a quick follow-up on that. I mean, the concept of de-skilling seems to intersect your work on creativity quite a lot. Are the dangers of this sort of cooperative or collaborative of these systems, is that something that researchers are specifically looking at? You know, the machine could help someone be creative, but it could also lead to them being not so creative.
Yeah. So now I'm affiliated at the Department of Management. In management research, there's this concept of a technology acceptance model, or a TAM model, and it's pretty straightforward when you talk about it. It essentially looks at perceived ease of use and perceived usefulness. But when you get into AI and co-creative AI, hybrid intelligence, it becomes much more complicated. And so in the study, the study I mentioned with Autodesk researchers, we developed a hybrid intelligent technology acceptance model that takes into consideration a lot of these factors, like your perceived partnership, perceived trust, perceived transparency, perceived learning. And so it's really trying to develop a more fine-grained method. It's basically structural equation modeling. If you look at the system and looking at each aspect, whether it's the control, the willingness to train, willingness to adapt, and willingness to adopt the technology, these different components, and seeing what are the end users' perceptions, fears, and levels of trust in the technology that they're using.
Okay. So it's actually 12:59. Anna, can folks continue? I don't know if Dr. Raffner has.
I mean, we have a break now after this, so you could if you wanted. I think there's one interesting question there. I think Joe Kibler. So I'm happy you guys to go on a little longer if you're up for it.
Sure.
Okay. Well, there are two questions. One quickly. Do folks have access to Crea? That's from Sherry Jolshagen.
Yes,
okay.
I can share it in the chat if you want to play it. So it will take me a minute to get it,
Okay.
to get the link and put it in, so I can do that. But you'll have to give me a moment.
Okay, and Joe Kubler, while she's doing that, if you actually want to ask your question, you could do that, or I could just read it out, whichever you would prefer.
Yeah, I can ask if you can hear me.
We can hear you. Yep.
Perfect. My question was wondering if you thought that reinforcement learning from human feedback, like what's being used with to train some of the large language models right now, could be used to develop a like a novel creativity, a creativity model or metric.
I'm sorry, I'm really not so great at multitasking.
Okay, sorry about that.
trying
Sorry,
to
that's
get the
my
links.
fault. That's my fault.
No problem. It's a great question. I just didn't think about getting the link ahead of time. So I have to find it. We don't keep it posted online.
Anna has hybridintelligence.eu/Crea.
Yes, that is the website.
Okay.
But we don't keep it posted online because we have some level of control with experiments. So it's freely available, but we try to keep some level of control. Here, I believe this link should work.
Okay.
That is for Crea. And then I also can share a previous version of Crea Visions. The current one right now we're using in an experiment today. So that's why I don't have it. But you can see. That is actually on the website. So the Crea Visions link you can get from the website. So I won't spend more time searching for that.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay, no problem.
Joe, if you would care to re-ask your question.
Yeah, it was about wondering, basically, you mentioned it being challenging to find any agreed upon metric or even model or notion, definition of creativity. And my question was if you think that the reinforcement learning from human feedback techniques, like what's being used to train some of the large language models, could be used to develop a creativity model or metric.
So
if that makes sense.
What do you mean by that? Human feedback on creative tasks. So a cyclical process where humans are giving feedback on a task, almost like a crowdsourcing method, or are you interested in what the human feedback is on algorithmic outcomes? I'm not quite sure I understand what direction you're going in there.
I was thinking about using the outputs of generative, let's say like an image generation model, and using human feedback to develop creativity assessments or models or metrics.
So Joe, do you mean like creativity as adaptation or adaptability on the human's part?
I mean, as well, yeah, as something that's if in my understanding, the use of human feedback reinforcement learning is being used to create responses that are more human-like in text generation prompts. So I was thinking if it could be applied in the same definition, if even if there are different notions between different individuals of creativity, but to rank the creativity of outputs of these image generation models, and what, could that be used to generate a notion of creativity at scale, I suppose.
Yeah, so if I understand correctly, I'm not sure if I do, but I'll try. There is quite a bit of research out there on a technique is called consensual assessment. So it's essentially trying to get a broad overview where you have lots of different people giving their perspectives on a creative output. And there's research as to whether or not they have to be experts or whether or not they can be members of the general public. There also have been several crowdsourcing campaigns to get lots of people to give responses to these. So that has been studied somewhat. Without great results. It hasn't been specifically on AI outputs. I also know that there, actually a good friend of mine is doing work on AI image curation, which is different from what I've talked about here, but it's a fascinating phenomena that artists are now not creating their work for other humans, and they're creating their work for algorithms, which then promote the work on social media and other areas, other platforms. So this dialogue between, okay, humans trying to evaluate what the algorithm likes, then the human is trying to make something that an algorithm is going to then post that hopefully other humans like. It's a really complex circle that you can get into. With regards to different types of reinforcement models, I'm working on a project now with a researcher. His name is Roger Beatty. He's at Penn State University, and we've developed a small game. It's called Lynx, and for this, we are essentially looking at distant association between words. So I am given the word tile, and I have to think of something far away from it, like quantum, whatnot. And in that case, then we have an algorithm which evaluates it and says, okay, based on a semantic analysis, how close or how far away are these words? We have incorporated another aspect there, which is human feedback. So because some of these relationships are so contextual, it can be considered close or distant from from an algorithmic perspective, but we may not be aware of all of the human contexts. So we're building in a hybrid intelligence loop there, where participants are then giving back their feedback to evaluate, yes, I think this is appropriate distance, that makes sense, or no, this doesn't, and why. So there are lots of opportunities for further incorporating humans into that process, that training process. And with respect to a model, I think that there are just amazing opportunities for trying to, you could say, reconsider the field of cognitive and neurocognitive creativity research in light of human AI co-creativity. I'm also working on an article on that right now that highlights the opportunities for understanding more about the processes that are happening in the brain, be it cognitive, behavioral, or neurocognitive, based on the types of interactions that we have with humans and algorithms.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That was really, really great, and look forward to reading that that upcoming paper. Thank you.
Okay. Well, it's 1:08. If no one else has any questions, we can thank Dr. Raffner again. I will clap. But okay, thank you again, Dr. Raffner.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. We will be meeting in about 15 minutes for the next session. Thank you for staying on later as well, Janet, to answer further questions. I really
It's dinner time now.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
I'm ready for
Off you go. Well done.
Okay.
Thanks. Have a great break, everyone.
Thanks. It was nice meeting folks, and yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
I'll be reading about you soon.
Yeah.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Good day.
Bye-bye.